Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Observable Flutter. I am your host, Craig Labenz, and today I'm excited to discuss a possible new way to style our Flutter apps using an exciting new library that really is near and dear to my heart. So I'm looking forward to getting into it. So let's waste as little time as possible. As a reminder, everybody, this is the Flutter community. We want to be our best selves, be as kind to each other as we can, all that good stuff. You know the drill. All right. So today I'm ultimately going to be joined by Leo Farias, the Flutter and Dart GDE and creator of a library called Mix. But I'm not going to spoil the punchline on Mix. I'm going to let Leo tell you all about it. So, Leo, welcome to Observable Flutter. Would you like to say a few words about yourself?
Yeah, thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure for us to finally talk again. Um, yeah, it's as you mentioned, I'm a Flutter and Dart GDE UI. For the reasons I fell in love with Flutter, I'm always been very interested in the UI piece, how to build systems, like the interactive design side of things. And even though you have a nice mix creator of Mix, it's a lot of people. I think we even discussed this initially on the GDE interview that you're doing. I think that's where I shared with you like a rough draft in the beginning. But a lot of people from the community have come in and helped and given feedback and explored, because it has been a lot of work in order to prioritize the development experience and to try to get in a way that gives flexibility, but is still consistent with what you expect from Flutter and the Flutter APIs.
Yeah, you're right. You did tell me first about this. I don't remember how long ago that was, but I remember in my notes I wrote experimental project called Mix, similar to style sheets for Flutter.
Yes.
And I uh, I must confess I did basically forget about that, which is very silly because for an extremely long time, I've been thinking about exactly this problem and how I wish Flutter had a solution like this. So it's inconceivable that I didn't latch on to Mix immediately in that moment. I don't know what was distracting me, but I'm excited to today. So yeah, would you like to give us a little intro of the concepts, and do you think it's time to pull up some documentation for that?
Yeah, we can pull up some documentation and I'll go over and discuss. And this is an interesting thing that you mentioned, Craig. You know, it's very tough sometimes to define, especially when you think the way Flutter is and the way Flutter works. But that's the tagline, the closest I come up with, which is a styling system for Flutter. And you mentioned that you forgot about Mix, and so I started creating Mix as a draft for some problems that I had that a lot of people are familiar with on the Flutter side. And I released open source, I think version like 0.0.6, and I put a big warning saying, do not use this. APIs will change. And I probably made small fixes, and within a few months, I had some very large enterprise companies. They're trying to bring their whole like well laid out, mature design systems into Flutter. They kept stumbling upon Mix and how Mix solved a lot of problems on the design system side. And funny thing, version 0.0.7, which is not even 1.0, is actually in production in apps that have millions of users. And that's one thing. That's when I start saying, okay, so this is not just a problem I had. That is a problem that exists, but it wasn't fully flushed out, right? Especially it comes with the implementation, interactions. I didn't want to change the logic. So I'm gonna start with a quick introduction, and I'll mention. Go ahead.
Could I ask you to just command plus this page maybe twice?
Yes.
Perfect. Great.
All right. So I'll start with a disclaimer because it stands, in the world of Twitter, X, previously known as Twitter, and Reddit and so on, is Mix is not meant to replace the way you currently theme material widgets and things like that. You can, but I like to be very clear that it only because it's there doesn't mean you should just use it. You should understand what problems it solves and try to understand where it fits in. And there's two places that I think Mix fits really well right now. One is when you're building consistent design systems, right? That have a very defined style guide and you want to be able to maintain and so on. Another one is when you have a lot of complex logic that is, I'll say, styling logic, right? Things that are like, okay, I want this to happen when it's on dark, but only if it's on a small screen, and if you're focused and if you're on hover, then Mix also, I think, kind of shows its benefits very clearly, which we're gonna demo a little bit. So the main goal of Mix is to create a way to have the visual semantics. When I say visual semantics, I'm going to use styles. In Flutter, sometimes these are visual properties or attributes of things like container, but this can be also themes, right? Like button themes and so on. So these visual styles, but allowing them to be composable, mergeable, be able to edit, be able to override only specific parts within the tree, right? So be able to have full access to that. So one example is you have a decoration, which can be a box decoration, can have a border, and a border can have a left, a right, and sometimes you wanted to reuse everything that you had before in the decoration, right? I love it. My decoration is perfect, but I would like the border rights to be different, right? And I want to do this with a very simple change. So essentially, it kind of breaks down all these values and allows them to be overridable and merged and composed in different ways. And that ends up with better definition of. It separates the styling a lot, so it does allow to separate the style. If you come from the web, it'll be the style sheet in a separate file, and be able to also use it outside of the build context. Okay. I would like to do briefly. Actually, I can show. Actually, let me show a demo here. So this is the example I'm going to be showing, which is a comparison of with Mix and without Mix. And Greg, I think that's one thing that you mentioned even when we did the interviews, like, Leo, it'd be nice to have. I would like to have a comparison. So
brilliant. So
yeah,
you did it.
So yes, that's what I've been working on for the past 2 years. This comparison.
Incredible.
And so pretty much with Mix, I can have a separate file and I can define its styling, right? Now, essentially I can see here, and this is just a convention that we're using, but you don't have to use this utility. You can actually create your own utilities or bring it in, but this is just a convention that we're using. You can pretty much here define, right, a box height, a width, a padding, the elevation I want, the alignment of the box. And a box is a container, which you can share the actual code. A box is a container. We just call it box because it's so reused, so it's almost become an alias. And it also brings up some decoration properties that be on box decoration border. It just bubbles up these utilities also, right? So now I have border radius, I have color. It does allow me also to actually reference tokens, which you can discuss, and define the colors, right? Textile the color. I can actually do this with scale, and this is a modifier. It means that it's going to wrap my widget with a scale widget.
Nice.
So essentially, this allows me to bring in other widgets that are not integrated with Mix, and people can build their own integrations they can use and so on.
Gotcha.
And then I use context variants like on dark and on hover, right? So essentially, these are context variants mean that on dark, I want to apply these, on hover, I want to apply these.
Oh, and I see nice nesting there. So when it's hovering, then you also have more dark and light mode checks.
Yes.
Nice.
So by essentially is when I look at the style, and I have all my styling, I can see in one place, and this essentially becomes the logic for my widget, right? So essentially, I can change the styling completely, and of course, the goal is that the styling in the design system, you're going to have like borders are going to be reused, the elevation is going to be reused, the radius are going to be reused. So essentially, allows now to also bring in a lot of those things, right?
Nice.
This is equivalent in Flutter. Now, I try to be very fair. I know how those things can be. So if you think this can be a lot better without creating, of course, you can make it better without, with creating utilities and things like that. So essentially, you're recreating mix in a way, right? Or creating helpers.
Yep.
But I do invite people to, improve this, because I do think it's
sample,
to see how what is a fair comparison, right? Now, of course, you're going to see here that I'm not using material widgets because the goal is to create from scratch buttons. But you can see here that I'm defining the curve duration. And here I'm actually, checking if it's dark mode. I do set if it's dark, I change the background color, right? The border radius. I do have a logic for if it's on hover, but it's on dark, right? So essentially is I do the mouse region to trigger the hover. And essentially this is the code here. Okay, now was Mix created to just be cleaner? No, not at all. But one of the challenges that also solves is I do a lot of code review, and sometimes it says, "Oh, can we get rid of the scale?" And once you see the diff on Git, it pretty much breaks the whole tree. It becomes very difficult to understand what changed, right? And sometimes things can get through. A particular value changed, or something else changed. So now you can say, okay, no, the scale changed. That was the only change there. Right. It's not that the tree completely changed, and it's not exactly clear how. It's not as obvious, right? Everything looks like a big change when you're doing UI changes in Flutter.
Right, because even if you only add or subtract one widget somewhere in the tree, all your other lines are going to indent or unindent. And so, like you said, in Git, it becomes very noisy, and you really have to turn your brain on to figure out what actually changed. But this kind of removes that problem.
Yeah, and there's a lot of different benefits, but I'll go here. Here is the end result of both of the styling here. So, and of course, it's I don't know if there's a lag if it's a good card, but
it's looking good to me at least.
Yeah. So pretty much is, I want to move the text within, I want to change the padding, I want to lighten the color, I want to do a lot of different things. And this is an example of, I'll say a very simple one widget example. Now, a lot of people say, oh, why not just do container height? Why do I have to do box style height, right? Pass on, for example, imagine if all you're doing is passing container height, you don't have to create a style just to pass height. I mean, create a container height, right? That's why I think it is understanding when it should be used. In one of the interesting things that I see is that because whenever you're doing something new, and of course, I don't like to do new things just for the sake of doing new things, but I do think that innovation is important, right? For us to try to solve, and the community to come in and try to solve some problems that sometimes it could be blind spots or we're seeing, right? It's just a lot of information. So I think open source is almost like a great communication channel, right? If you get an open source project and people start using it, it says a lot to the community, like, okay, maybe this is an issue, right? That shouldn't be ignored or needs a little bit more attention, or the community can embrace. But that is one thing. The goal is not to completely replace their specific cases. And a lot of people, when they see people that work with design systems, or even sometimes they work with the web or other, I'll say, styling libraries that not built on top of material, they look at Mix like, I get it, I understand
Mhm.
it. And then there's a lot of people that for them is not as clear. And sometimes that it because they already built a lot of the utilities, a lot of challenges, a lot
Mhm.
of the things, or they already have a design system that they're basing on, right? It becomes a bit of a challenge, but it's always interesting to see that, because the great thing about Flutter is that when you have Flutter, you have material, meaning you have a very robust, mature design system. They're going to have a professional, beautiful looking app without worrying about anything. And that's a great thing to have, an official solution like that. And other platforms, especially hybrid platforms, they don't have that on the web. It's not as clear, right? You always have community UI libraries that you're using.
Mhm.
But the challenge becomes when you want to go a little bit beyond what material allows, and then that's where we start seeing some of the challenges.
Yeah. So I have so many questions, and I've been intentionally not diving into the mix documentation so I can just ask all of my beginner questions right now today,
It's
and
great.
then I'm excited.
I can check my blind spots. It's always good to have the fresh perspective too.
Right. So yeah, I'm happy to offer you the perspective of a total beginner here. So gosh, so many questions. So under the hood, you said this is using a container. The box selector is applied to a container, or no, it's the have you created a new box widget? Because you're applying these to custom widgets, right? Or are you applying them to widgets in the widget library?
So the goal, I'll share. Let me share some. Let me share
I guess to
the.
rephrase my question while you're pulling this up, if I want to use Mix, which I'm suspicious that I do, will I be using new fundamental widgets from the Mix library, or will I still be using Flutter widgets? I mean, it seems like I can't just be using Flutter widgets from the framework. I can't just be using those because they don't take this style class as a parameter and compose themselves. So I must need to use specific widgets from the Mix library as my base level building blocks. Is that right?
Yes. So, but the answer is a little bit. Let me show you the box, because I will touch in also. Um, I guess will be, depending which one will be probably the best approach.
Mm-hmm.
So the box widget. Uh, so the box widget is a style widget here, and this with Mix is if you can think the style almost like a transport, right? So pretty much it's just getting all these attributes, and what
Mm-hmm.
Mix does is converting this into a spec, which I'm gonna show how we build a spec. But a spec is also convention to say, okay, these are a widget specifications, right? The visual
Mm-hmm.
specifications of a widget. So we're calling these things a spec. And you can see if it's animated, there's an implicit animated widget. So if the
Brilliant.
style that comes in is animated, it already switches to an animated widget. And there's a box spec widget, right? And I'm keeping the convention of overly complicated widget names with the Flutter culture, because I feel like, as developers, it's good to be very
Specific. Yeah.
exact, specific.
Yep.
Okay, it's box
Yep.
spec, but it's widget.
Yep.
uh, so if you go here to the box spec, this is the box spec widget here.
Mm,
So it's a container, but at that point, that's where we set the defaults
you're right. And you're
uh,
translating all
and
of
things like
the
that.
mix concepts into normal container concepts.
Yes. So it becomes a container. And if you go to the animated, of course, there's a more, the implicit animated widget, but also it just returns a box spec widget.
By the way, I want to say to folks in the chat, there's some pretty good questions coming in. Just so you know, I'm starring them, and I'm going to get to all of these. So don't think you're asking your questions in vain. After the tour gets a little deeper, we'll pause and hit some of these questions. So keep them coming.
And that is one of the things that I think it'll be difficult because sometimes you want to bring in other layout models, other styling models, like on the web, like Flexbox or something like that, into Flutter, and that's not the goal at all, right? The goal is to I guess make those visual properties more accessible and composable, and that's why when people say like, "Oh, what is a box?" Oh, it's like a container. No, it is a container, right?
It's not like a container. It is a
Yeah,
container.
yeah. So, and the same goes for what I call like are the primitives, right? The primitives, and in Mix, the goal for Mix is to have these very simple primitives: text, image, flex, stack, um, text. So are these very simple primitives, and those things become very clear.
Yeah. Okay, so you mentioned flex and stack, and so that makes me think obviously layout concepts,
Mhm.
positioning concepts. So do you have that as well? Because a second ago I thought I heard you say that recreating concepts like flex box was out of scope, but it sounds like maybe that you can position
Yeah.
things with Mix.
Yes. So, and I might get confused because I'm going to show you a widget called Flexbox.
Great.
But when I say Flexbox, I'm talking about the I guess the layout, right? That is common on the web. So, for example, one thing that you notice is that Flutter doesn't have things like negative margins, right? Negative paddings and things like that. Some other layout models you can do those things, which sometimes it's a learning curve, but once you get it, it becomes a lot better to understand the layout model of Flutter. But the same thing here. Let me show you a Flexbox. So there is a widget called Flexbox, and what this widget does, it pretty much just gets the box and the flex into the same widget, right? So for example, if I want to create a row, but normally when I create a row, I don't want to just create a row and just align it. Sometimes I want to give it a background. I want to give borders also. So I'm with a
Yep.
container anyways. So what Flex box allows you to do is to just very simply define, flex, main axis alignment, start, and then box color, and then you can just use flex and it'll work, right? And they are pretty much alias for things, like a style row if you need it. So there's some primitives there for more like the design system specific things. And these are the equivalent of the column H box. Oh, sorry, the row, the H box, and the column, the V box. So
VBox, yeah, perfect.
yeah, so it just allows you to say, okay, I want a box, but it's going to be a flex
Right.
layout, right? So I can just do flex VBox, and I have an example of that also. So let me know if I'm
I think this
going a
is
little bit too
great.
fast.
Yeah, gosh, I love this. And it also, of course, anyone who's done any Swift UI stuff, which I've only very recently started exploring just to know how it looks, the VStack and HStack are very simple, very easy to use, and VBox and HBox look the same. I love the idea of the Flex box widget, which is a funny name given how overloaded that combination of words is. But yeah, just that idea of like, sure, you might want a row or a column, but you also want to give it a background. And so Mix is going to handle the task of composing that row or column within a container and applying the appropriate styles, whether it's background color, padding, whatever, and and creating a thing that it's a little harder in vanilla Flutter because you have to do that composition yourself. And I love the direction this implementation is going in.
Yeah, and the same thing here, right? So you can think, if you look, okay, what is the flex box? And now these shortcuts kind of set in the direction, but it's the same thing you do with, like this, right? Oh. So it'll be the equivalent of container in a flex, whatever the flex row, container, and so on, right? So it becomes a bit clear because I won't say I never do, but I think most of the time I do wrap a container in my rows and column, unless it's very layout specific, right? When it's not visually specific, I'm building within a component or something like that. So, and this is one thing that we are working on and making available, especially to make it easier to create your own specs. And let me show you the flex first, because I like to get right.
So this spec class, this is kind of the core building block of the styling system.
Yes.
Okay.
So what I do is using code generation, and we look forward for macros, but there's still some things that are very specific. But I think with macros are going to make things very powerful. But pretty much I just create a class, and the class defines the values.
Okay.
From flags, and we do have one called gap, right? So if you want a gap in between the children,
nice.
We do allow for that. And just some helpers of if you want to get a flex directly from the context or from the context. So pretty much this is what I need. And what the code generation will do. Sorry, I have to go over my mic. So it's
no, trust. I know the struggle.
So pretty much it handles, all the logic of generating the copy width, generating the lerp methods for it. As you can see here, for example, these are simple, but in this example here, the gap actually can animate.
Okay.
And it does the equality already to keep it consistent, because the equality is very important, especially when you're moving a lot of values around. And one thing it does is also it creates the flex spec attributes. And the flex spec attributes is essentially the fully nullable tree, right? So for example, in Flutter, if you want to do a shadow and you set a shadow, the shadow has a default value. The box shadow has a default value, right? But sometimes you want to just override a specific piece of the shadow. And that is, so for a lot of these classes, we created DTOs. And DTOs, they can also be automated because they are essentially the same properties, but all of them are nullable. And if one of those properties also have properties to be defined, they also bring their DTOs, right? And I'll provide an example. And also it creates the resolve. And this is all done through code generation, right? So automatically does the resolve to it. You can actually set animation per spec, but if not, it defaults to whatever the spec that was passed within the the animation that was passed within the style. And it does the merge, right? And I say that in the case of flex, because a lot of these things are enums, it just overrides them if they exist. But that's why I started with this example. And then it automatically also creates the utility. So the utility that you're seeing on this example here, see here. So these utilities here, for example, that you see box or flex, this is automatically generated. And one thing that you can see is that it pretty much looks for every field, and every field type has an utility type, right? And pretty much it just creates some helpful things, but it automatically generates and passes every single utility. And this is, again, all code generated. Also setting animation, setting the gap, and allowing for you to do, flex only and passing a value. You can do that also. And creating the tween also automatically. So it kind of gives you all the pieces already. So when you create a spec for a widget, and the goal, one thing that you can do, and there's already been discussion, is that creating a spec for things like app bar theme, right? Because you can just set the properties automatically generate, and then you can just use. And the next step is for us to even generate the mix equivalent widget automatically, right? Because you can see that you have a widget like a container, and you have a mix equivalent, right? So the same thing will be for the app bar and so on. And I'll show the box, because the box, especially big, it might be a little bit more detailed. But the box is a fairly complicated one, if you will. But one thing the box does also, yeah,
this has got to be the single most important building block, I imagine, is that just the box.
Yeah. But one thing the code generation does is pretty much write the same properties that you find on the container here, right? All those things are here, same thing, but it allows me to override with utilities. So we talked about kind of exposing those utilities up. So if I go here to this box decoration utility here, all I'm doing is say, okay, I'm going to get a box decoration utility. So I don't want this to be a decoration type. I actually want to be a box decoration utility. And I define all the properties that I want to bubble up a level. So box, I want to bring up box color, box border directional, border radius. So essentially, I'm just setting all these things and bringing it up. And then even on gradients, I can say, okay, now for box decoration gradients, I have an utility that has radial and linear. I want to bring them up, and I also want you to change the name, right? And that's when you end up with things like box.color, box.radial gradients, box.linear gradients, and things like this, like box shadows, right? So instead of having box shadows, so just say box.shadows, box.shadow, and elevation, so on. But you can see that this also generates everything the box needs, and it is consistent. And you can see here that now actually the lerp becomes more complicated because of the geometry, but it's actually using the Flutter classes. And it automatically handles the lerp for animations automatically. Equality, like we talked about, the attributes. It also now it resolves the values, because these are transport values, right? These are data transfer objects, so DTOs. So it says, okay, I want to get the spacing DTO, and I want to resolve to an edging set. I want the decoration as a decoration DTO, it resolves to decoration, right? So pretty much it does this for every single piece automatically. And this is what this is the magic. If you want to see like what the magic of Mix is pretty much merging everything down, and everything can merge itself. And it's interesting because one thing you can do is, if you have, let's say, a box shadow color and you override it, you can actually much later just have box shadow color with opacity. And what you're doing, you don't even have a reference to the color. And I'll show an example of that. But you say, hey, I don't want you to add a color, but whatever color comes in, I want you to change it, right? And this is the example that we see here. So here you can see that textile color. Make it a little bit bigger.
Okay.
So pretty much I'm saying is that I don't care what color it is. Line whatever color it is, and this happens because you can merge and also merge the directives, so you can have a lot of flexibility of some of the things you can do, right? Whatever color comes in, you're going to line, and this can be done with colors and tries to replicate the color utilities, brighten, saturate, and so on. But it allows to have a interesting approach. And a lot of the feedback is like, oh, this is great, why not just have utility that gives elevation and padding and things like that? Like that is not the goal for Mix, but I do think that could be great for the community, right? There's nothing holding you back from doing these composable utilities that just accept the color and return an attribute, right? So almost become these like little computation functions for different pieces, logic, and so on for the styling, because you've completely separate them both, right?
All right. So my top question right now, and this kind of builds on your comment from a second ago about how that resolve function is the magic. And by the way, great questions continuing to come in the chat. My star list is continuing to grow. Your questions will get airtime, so please keep asking them.
I see you
So,
have a fan also.
what's that?
I see you have a fan. I just see
Yeah, I'm a taken man, deep need. So, oh, you have a fan too, actually. Before we get too far away, let me just throw up Henrique's comment from the very beginning. Big fan of Leo. So
Thank you.
don't think you're not without your own fans there, Leo.
You
So,
had this one on the chamber.
all right. So what I'm wondering about is I'm writing my app, and let's say I've got this box style class, but of course, I'm going to have a lot of different styles of boxes across my app. And the next task becomes pairing the right widgets with the right styles. And so I've declared all of my styles in a different file. And so I love that. And now in a build method, I'm composing something. And let's say within the same build method, I've got 3 different boxes that all need to be attached. They all need to have their appropriate style passed to them. Is there any kind of selection and matching process handled by Mix where essentially I can do something like a CSS class or ID or some kind of pseudo selector so that the widget can do like the mix of context and evaluate and find its own thing? Or am I just passing the correct style into the correct mix widget every time?
Yeah. So I'll show an example because I think even addressing that question, one thing that Mix does, which I think is the only, let's say, change in behavior. Oh, Flutter wouldn't be able to do that, but essentially is if I have a box and I pass text stylings and I have text widgets under it, it will inherit those. So it does inherit. It does that for, and you can flag it, you can turn it on and off if it should inherit or not.
Okay.
But things like icon for text and so on, because sometimes you want a box with the text and you go over and you want to define in one place, and every text inherits. So that would be similar to a div on the web. But the web, it's a lot more flexible where, a span, which is the line comment, can becomes a block, elements, and becomes fairly complicated. But I think I'm gonna have an example of.
And while you pull this up, I think it's okay to not take on the full complexity and flexibility of CSS in the web, because that is incredibly computationally intense for every single DOM element. That the browser has to do very expensive merges for every single browser element to traverse the entire CSS tree and find every rule that applies and then merge them. And it has to do that for every DOM element on every frame, which is why when you grab the corner of your browser and you just wiggle it around, the browser does update, but it's like really janky, and it's, talk about dropped frames. Browsers drop frames when they're trying to do this task too fast. And so, it sounds like Mix has opted into like, no, you've defined your style over here, you've got your widget over there, and you just please pass it into the widget. And that is a little bit more, maybe a little more headache for us, the developer, but I think that's probably going to pay huge performance dividends for Mix in the long run.
Oh, and also, I'll touch on an example, because if you want a specific style instead of setting classes, because on the web you have things like tailwinds, and people say, "Oh, Mixes tailwinds," which I don't like it. I mean, I use tailwinds, but everything is typed, and I feel like, for example, as soon as you put in the convention, right, pound, you can see all the specs that you have access to, and then if you put text dot, you can see all the tree. So essentially everything is typed, and you can see, instead of saying, okay, here's a reference to something else, right? In this case, the reference would be the style itself that is being passed down. But to your point, it doesn't mean you have to recreate it. So I'll show an example of this card here on the right side. And sorry, I try to scale it up, but hopefully people can get the point across. But so essentially is I have a base text, and pretty much I say, okay, I want the text color to be white and a certain font size. And here, what I want to do is, for the description, I want to use the base style. So even though I define a style here, I say I want to use this base style. And also the order matters. So by using here, I pretty much I'm saying, hey, I want you to use this as the foundation, and then I might overwrite some values there, right?
Right.
And the good thing here, to the example, is that in base text, I have color white. And what I do is say, okay, I want to get you the color, and I want to change the opacity. So I don't have to define a color. I'm just saying, hey, define the opacity. Of course, 1, it's not a great...
doesn't change a ton.
Yeah. But yeah,
so that'll make it a little darker in this context, right? A little gray will shine through.
Yeah. So, and then I can do things like the title. Same thing here, right? So actually, since I'm both overriding this, I can do just something like this, right? I don't need it. So and then I have the title, and here's the structure of the style. Okay.
And you said order matters. So if you put that where you define the title, if you put the base one at the bottom, then it would start with 18, but override it with 12. Is that right?
Correct. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So so this kind of goes a little bit. So it doesn't mean that you have to define. The goal is to have maybe some of these foundational styles, for text, or maybe for I'll always want elevation to use, I don't know, the own primary color and to be 5. So I can just bring this in. Essentially, I can have like a box, and I'm just bringing in this elevation, this font size, right? You can break it down to small pieces. So it does give a lot of flexibility. But this is one thing that allows me to define a base style and override it. In here, I define a container, and you can see here. So I have a container, and sorry, let me show you here. So this is a VBox with the container style, and I have the children, right, with the title style and description style. And I'm going to touch on variants, what they are. So pretty much I'm defining this here, right? So main axis alignment, cross axis, I do a gap, so automatically creates a gap in between them, and I do padding, width, border radius, and so on, right? So so pretty much by doing this, I've created a card. But another thing that Mix does that you talked about, it's not as it can be thought of classes from the web, meaning on how it can be overridden, because Mix allows you to create variants of this style, right? So let me show you what the variant is, right? So here I have 2 types of variants. So I have a variant style. It just extends the type variant, which is a mix, and it just accepts a string. It's nothing. And the reason variants are important, and the reason they are just a string, is because they can be used for design tokens in a lot of different workflows, right? But essentially, all you're doing is say, okay, I'm going to create a type of alert style because I like to have a specific type for this, so it's a little bit more clear. But I'm just passing a string, right? It doesn't do anything alert style. But what I can do now...
And this is all code. This is not generated code. A developer using Mix writes this code, right?
Yes. And again, this is just something, nothing holds you back from, doing something like this and not using outline. You can say outline, right? For example. But the goal is to have everything typed, documented, and also this allows you to have a file called widget.variants. And once you look at the file, you know all the styling variants in one place. So by having a separate file, it just becomes like, okay, here's the tokens of reference, so you don't have to look over again. So, which which I think is my favorite feature of. Go ahead. Sorry.
Oh, I was just going to ask now, in my build method, how do I tell? How does a box, you've got selected or not selected, right? Maybe there's 10 items and the user is checking the ones that they care about. And so they're moving in and out of this selected state. In my build method, how do I say that a widget is selected?
So once you get the style itself, you just apply variants, and you can pass all the variants that you want to be applied. So for example, if you create a variant called selected,
okay,
on your widget, you just say, okay, if the property came in selected, then you just gotta say apply this variant. That would be the logic, right? So you can see here that all I'm doing in this example, and again, this is a internal example to showcase. Now, of course, this will be more robust. So for example, we work on a design system that has a button, and it has 4 different types, 3 different sizes, right? And you have very simple logic, right? You have a variant for size, a variant for styles, and you can build 10 different components there.
Mm-hmm.
But by doing this, and this is one of my favorite features of Darts that I think is underused, is the callable method. Because what this allows you to do is you create a variant that itself is a reference to a variant, but also it becomes the way they interact with the style. So when I define a style, I'm saying, okay, I have a variant called outline, and I'm going to pass this variant around. But I actually can call it and pass it styles.
Yep.
And it's going to apply here.
Yeah, that definitely helps with the syntax of defining these.
Yeah,
it's a lot cleaner with that.
Yeah, and you can see I have implemented the logic here, but you can see here that I have filled, right? And you can see just by changing now, and I have it in one place, right? And again, you can create a separate style if you want just for the variants, and then again, you can compose it however you want, but it does allows for a lot of different possibilities. If I want to do field, and that one I want to have an elevation, and I want to be on dark, I want to have these colors and the border colors, and so it just becomes a lot cleaner approach to it. And if you are working with a component that has a lot of variations of it, a mix is something to take a look, because it's kind of optimized also for that, right? So for example, the logic of creating 6 different buttons, it's extremely clean because all the styling is outside. All the variants are clear. I have sizing variants, I might have styling variants, I might have whatever, I have state variants that could be like checked, not checked, and so on. But it becomes a great way to use, and also it kind of helps with documentation by seeing it variants and using the references there. So I think that's the closest to, let's say, a class that
absolutely
use.
Yep.
So but it does override, right? So it's the foundational, and it pretty much is using everything here plus what's here, right? So it uses this as the foundation.
Yeah, it's honestly for anyone who's written Sass from the web world, which is this kind of like alternate nested CSS, and then there's a build step that flattens it into actual valid CSS. This is basically that, and that's a great system for declaring styles. Sass is so much nicer to write than plain CSS for that reason. Okay, man, I'm excited about this. I really like what I'm seeing. With about a month ago, I was calling it universal styling, which is what I put on the title card for this. And I started just an experiment myself and spent a couple multi-hour exploration sessions where I was just poking around with how something like this might work. And then I think it was Seth from the Flutter team, Seth Ladd, retweeted your 1.0.0 announcement for this, and I looked at it and was just like, immediately, I'm reaching out to Leo, and I get to delete my experiment and stop working on it because this is exactly what I was thinking. And you're just merely 2 or 3 years ahead of me, so great work there. Now I've got a. Do you think, to get to some of the questions from chat, or do you have any more kind of aspects of the intro to Mix we should get to?
I can, if you want, I can show. I can show two uses, more complex uses for Mix, and I would like to just briefly touch on what I think is interesting about Mix. That it might not be Mix itself, but it is the community. So let me load this example real quick. So this example is, I'm going to pull it up here. So this is an example. This is the whole widget that is having the styling. So you can see here, if I open up the widget, all it does is passing a style that animates, right?
Yeah, okay.
And you can see here that, it reflects the mouse. If I press it, it changes the scale, it outlines, right? So it does all that by just passing a style. And just to touch on a couple things that I'll say the more advanced use cases. But on Mix, you can see here that we're defining, high border radius, gradient, so on. And I have these modifiers, right? The scale and opacity. And one thing that Mix allows you to do is to have variant operators. So you don't want a style to happen when you have only one variant. Maybe you want to happen, in this case, for example, I want to happen if it's on press and on long press. And that's why, it applies both ways, right? And I can do if it's only both of them. So it allows to do that. Another great feature, unused feature of Darts.
Yeah, you've overridden bitwise operators.
Yeah. So this allows you to essentially combine and do small logic. And again, it's always good to maybe define a separate variant and so on. But it's one situation that, okay, if it's on dark and on focus, I want to do this, you can consolidate in one place, right? And you can see here that on long on press, I apply this, right? So essentially I have the box styling and I have this final styling here. And you can see here that all animates and all these utilities were created through code generation, right? Now, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I mean, maybe you're about to get to what I'm going to ask, but inquiring minds have to know. How is the mouse cursor position being tracked? Where's that coming from?
All right.
You just pass a callback.
Yeah. So if I use on hover, pretty much it says when on hover, apply the style. But some context variants also allow you to pass the event, which is actually listening to the values that come in. So essentially, is the event comes in with a position, and of course, I have these helper functions here. But pretty much what I'm doing is I'm defining an offset, and I apply the logic directly, and I return a style. So now pretty much is with the mouse, I'm calculating the style itself and how it should update.
And that last line there, 73, that's what's adding the glimmer or like the reflection effect, right?
Correct. And it's funny to I don't know if it's there's something special when you say I want to put the position in one place, and you just happen to have a utility that if you call it, you can just add it, and it's just perfect.
Right,
and, so things like that are very interesting. But I'll say like this is an advanced example that I said like, okay, if you have a lot of, because all this, there's no business logic, right? I mean, there's styling logic, right? But there's nothing specific that's doing it, calling an API or a callback. These are just styling logics. But I think this is a good example. And if you have time, I can share one more quick example.
We've got time. This was a great example. I'm glad we made time for it.
All right.
That was cool.
And to touch on this one, So this is a separate project. Let me just pull up. That called SuperDoc. So giving a lot of presentations, for these events and things like that. I wanted to pretty much add Markdown, and let me just pull up the style real quick. All right. So pretty much I wanted to have a presentation that is written in Markdown, and I'll put here slide.
I'm suspicious this is going to blow everyone's mind. Keep going.
So pretty much I've created a presentation, and everything you'll see here, and of course I can reference, and I'll do a little demo here, but I can have different layouts, right? And you can see here, like pretty much I'm just referencing media and right. So I can do different things, but maybe it's for another day. I'll talk about SuperDoc. I even turns down like mermaid syntax, but I like to focus on one thing that I wanted to do. One thing I wanted to do is I wanted to give control over the styling of I want to essentially create a class, like a styling class on the web, that I could completely overwrite the style of it, right? So same thing I did here. I created a variance, right? A slide variant called red, which is the other example I did. And by using the code generation, there's this Markdown library that accepts the styling. And all I did is I wrapped the Markdown styling from the package into Mix, and I generated the code, right? So pretty much it says, okay, you can have a Markdown table, a Markdown text style. You can have a code block, right? So I ran code generation, and it pretty much created the utilities and everything. Now, the cool thing is because now, and this one has this red example, by changing this value here, I can actually change the theme. So for example, even the border, if I want white, I can change it, right? So by wrapping this widget styling mix, of course in the application I have a logic to apply a variance. It allows me to completely let me do a Roboto.
Yeah, can we get a fixed?
Yeah.
Oh, it's that font. Okay.
Yeah, so you can see,
I'm wanting fixed width for the code on the right.
So you can see here that everything here is customizable, right? And you have control of every styling. And I even brought in the same logic of the hover to it.
Yeah.
All that is ideal, meaning that like pretty much everything that you have, you can override it. And it's interesting because you can end up creating things like, I want a gradient with a background image. I can do those things. But why I think this is where I guess the last thing is why I think Mix is interesting is because by removing the styling, and of course we talk about widgets and material and things like that, but it actually gives a clean API for all the packages that would like to give. I would like to change just the styling, but I don't want people to go and touch the logic of the widgets, right? And kind of go in and change it. So it allows to do that, and it's I think it's a great experience. And by doing that, so for example, there's some people that are creating like a Tailwinds version of the package using Mix. And the reason is because essentially you're just translating these Tailwind classes into a variant of multiple styles, right? So essentially you can do that. But the interesting thing is to actually use the strings. So you could actually copy and paste all the strings, like the classes of the Tailwinds, and pass it into the widget, and it'll style exactly the same way. And Mix makes those things a little bit easier. So I just wanted to show this because I think it's an example of, it's not just using Mix for the assistant, it does provide a styling API for the packages, all the projects, all the things also.
Man.
Sorry if it's too much.
No.
It's been 2 years in the work since we talked. There's a lot of catching up.
Yeah, absolutely. No, this is incredible. All right, I'm going to switch over to questions from chat. I have a couple more of my own, but it's time to surface questions from the good folks watching from home. So you actually just addressed this one, and it would match my expectation as the question came in. I think you saw it as well. So is this Tailwind for Flutter? I would say no, but this is how you
Oh,
would make Tailwind for Flutter. Do you agree with
yeah.
that?
Yeah, so it's like Mix is I like to think as a better CSS, and the same way Tailwinds is built on top of CSS, it can be built on top of Mix.
All right, so I'm just going to go down the list of all the questions that I starred. Looks cool, but how does this work with other libraries that extend widgets too, like Riverpod, MobX, or hooks?
So so if separating the goal is separating the style. So the example of the variant, if there's state specific packages that you're using and you want to do conditional logic application, there are some helper methods within the style. If you want to, let's say, merge or like we talked about, apply variants or pick a variance. So there are some helper methods to allow to compose. But if you're using these packages just for states, then it just becomes the logic and saying how you want to apply the logic. Maybe it's a different style. Maybe is adding a style to another one. Maybe it's picking a variant of that style, similar to what we did on the variant example.
Yeah. So the way I understood that question is because you've introduced a new base class called styled widget, are there any conflicts if I want to use another library as well that has kind of its own maybe base class, right? So Riverpod has like consumer widget, consumer stateful widget, or whatever it's called. But here we have styled widget. And I presume you just compose those two
Yeah,
things because you can't extend both of them. That's what I thought the question was getting at. So I think you just combine
yeah,
them yourself.
yeah. So one thing, there is a primitive called mix builder. So if you don't want to, if your widget doesn't need the style widget, it just helps translating the mix into a spec, if you will. But there's a mix builder, and that pretty much accepts a styling, and it returns us a mixed data, which is the resolve data, and then you can do that whatever you want. So that's the
Okay.
primitive that is used internally. If you build a design system, you can do the mix builder, and it turns the style into a mixed data that you can grab a spec and the values, the variants, the context variants are resolved. Things like on dark, everything is resolved and is ready for you to just take the next steps with it.
To apply. Yeah. Nice. Okay, this one's kind of related. What is inside that styled widget class? Is it just extending widget or is it doing something else? And I forget, we might have peeked at this after this question came in, but also maybe not.
Let me here. So, right. So there's a lot of which is more typing internally because repetitive code, but pretty much this is the only thing that essentially is being done, right? It just pretty much gets the style and makes sure that if you call with mix is the method, right? That you can see here that it just passes a builder, and if inherited is true, it treats the inheritance for internal widgets because we want to keep the API the same. It might not be the case for other design systems. And pretty much, we resolve the style, you merge it if there's inherited, and you apply the modifiers, which is the widgets on top, right? So essentially, if you put a scale with scale, it pretty much adds those widgets, almost like you're wrapping the widgets with them. So this is just the convention to do that, but it doesn't do much besides that. It's just more like helper functions, so to avoid repetitive code.
Yeah. Okay. Next up, Carlos says, I don't understand the $sign with. And I think the question mark there is probably just their question and not the null check. But yeah, so we saw that with in a big style definition at some point. If we could go back and revisit that.
Yeah, so let me. All right. So I mentioned you don't have to use this, but it's a convention if you want. So pretty much it just maps into a utility, right? So if you don't like the width, you can have mod or whatever name you want and just pass the utility itself again, right? So you don't need to do it. And pretty much what the modifier does is wrapping the widgets, right? So pretty much is bringing in all the different utilities that wrapped all the widget. So any things that you don't like for example, whenever there's a context variance, is a convention to do on, because it means that it's going to happen on something. So it just allows you to reference it, but you don't have to use it. So whenever it's created, the code generation creates the spec, you can just reference to anything, but we made this easy, so not every time you have to kind of bring it in, right?
Gotcha.
And define the widget. But I think this is the question, hopefully.
Yeah. All right. This is another interesting one. How are you preventing the rebuild of an entire widget tree instead of only a single widget where the style changed, or simple context-based styles, or simple how? I think there's some word order issues, or maybe they're saying how are simple context-based styles working? Is it like theme.of? So I guess to focus this in, if my style changes somewhere, I presume just the entire dependent widget tree it will have to rebuild. But is there any other
No.
considerations?
So if the style changes, so there's two approaches to this, and I'll show you here the mixed data. So mixed data is the resolved value. And one of the things that we did code generations, because to avoid rebuilds, equality is very important, right? Because there's a lot of nested values. We want to make sure there's always very consistent. But the styles eventually become mixed data. So only because the style changes. Now, of course, it depends if you're passing as a parameter, it might cause the widget to rebuild, but not necessarily repaint. But even the widget that comes after that maybe depends on the mixed data. Changing the style doesn't mean that the mixed data changed. For example, if I have a style that has a variance and I add a new variance, but I haven't applied those variants, it means that the data is still going to resolve the same way. So the mixed data is going to remain the same. So that's another thing. However, if you change the style where the mixed data changes, so we do like box color, it's not within a variance, within a context variant, anything like that, then that's where it comes into a spec, because even though it might trigger a rebuild again on the mixed data, you at the end of the day, the final widget is resolving a spec, so it doesn't mean that the spec changed. So that's one of the things that essentially is making sure that we have multiple layers. They are, be able to check if that value specifically changed. Because one of the things that if we pass the style, which I think that touches on the concern, if I pass the style and in pretty much, let's say all the way down in the container, I just grab that style and I do off context, yeah, that'll be a mess. Because essentially, when all the widgets will be listening to the same changes there, right? So that's why it's specific to have that tree and reference them separately.
Gotcha. Yeah, I had that was illuminating. I had understood the question as meaning like, I guess when they wrote style there, widget tree instead of only a single widget where the style changed. I think I actually understood them to mean spec, right? When like once there's actually an impact on the widget tree, does everything have to rebuild? And I would expect at that point the answer is just yes, because that's how Flutter works.
Yeah, exactly. So if you change a container margin, it will do the same thing that changing the spec margin Moodle, right?
Yep.
So under
Yep.
things like that. Oh, sorry. I had a different understanding.
No, it's okay.
I think it was
Everything you
good.
said
Yeah.
was. I also, your understanding may have been correct, but I think thinking about it from either angle, both were interesting. Okay, I think we got to this one after the question came in, but it was starred all the same. If I'm not using any of the styling for Flexbox, will the wrapped oh no, we didn't. This is an interesting question though. Will the wrapped container still be present? Because the container is a size box with a style component. So basically they're saying, if I'm not using some of the juice that Mix can apply to a certain widget, will those extra widgets always still be added, with concerns of potentially that adding up?
Yeah. So I think that is up to. I think that goes into implicit and explicit. So, for example, is the equivalent if I'm doing a flex box? It is the equivalent of wrapping a container in a flex, meaning we want to have the assurance that the styling choices do not change the expectation of the user, right? So it's better for them to always expect that if you use a flex box, it's going to be a box with a flex. However, there are other helpers if you want to use without the box, right? So you have a styled row, you have a styled column. So those don't have the box. But to make sure it's consistent, because then it becomes a little bit tough to the person to understand why. Oh, when I change the color, maybe the layout might change somehow, or different things.
Yeah, or
Which is
changing the
not
color means a new container shows up.
exactly.
It'd be nicer to have just the container have already been there. Yeah.
And
one
that's
thing I would.
sorry, go ahead.
No, you go.
No, and that's another reason that we kind of added the modifiers as a separate thing with, because we want it to be explicit when you're essentially adding a widget to the widget tree. So when you do with scale, it means it's going to add the scale to the widget tree. So it becomes more clear with it.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. One thing I would also say to all of us Flutter developers out there is the Flutter spends most of its time compositing, doing things in the engine, building the display list, rendering the display list, which involves running all the shaders and compositing the different layers together. Like that's where most of your frame budget goes. The widget tree itself will usually rebuild very, very quickly. Obviously, we can all engineer a counterexample to this that proves that this statement isn't universal. But in general, that's where Flutter spends most of its time. And this is actually even more true with Impeller, whose kind of a founding principle of Impeller is to be so fast that it doesn't have to use any raster caching. So when you're using Impeller in your app, even if you just change 1 pixel, the system is now designed to rerun every shader, recomposite everything. Like, render objects may not call paint and layout again if they weren't affected, but the display lists that they produce, the drawing commands that they produce will still be reevaluated from scratch, and all the shaders will be rerun and whatnot. And Impeller is designed for that to be a good thing, because then that simplifies caching and cache invalidation and all that stuff. So more than ever, it's true in Flutter that the little optimizations in your widget tree, they probably don't matter. Obviously, if you're seeing dropped frames, look into it, but I wouldn't stress the little minutia within a build method until you see dropped frames. That's my personal advice.
Yeah,
Take it with whatever grains of salt you want.
I think that's great insight. And one thing that we try to do at Mix is, so pretty much you have these lists of attributes and you're combining them, you're merging them, but there's no computation happening. The computation only happens when you need to apply within the widget. So when you do box spec of context, when it goes into the context to do what it needs to do. So it's just at that point that it does that, because then it's just pretty much, going through lists, right? List of items and so on. So it'll be cheap.
Yeah, and the lookup on inherited widgets is always constant time because the element
Yeah.
tree keeps a direct map. So it doesn't like go, parent, are you what I want? Are you my mother? Are you my mother?
Yeah.
Are you my mother? It knows immediately where the relevant element is whenever you use context.of. So that's also not like a full traversal of your widget tree.
And that was a great optimization that was added also is the inherited model on things like media query, because also that helped silo some styling logic only if the brightness changes, right? Instead of
Mm,
changing a lot of the values in media query. So that has helped a lot, especially in the case for mix, because now you're very specific to what would trigger a
yeah, a
change.
redraw. Yeah. One thing I know some people, I've heard folks talk about fear around using media query dot of size. And the thought is like, oh, well, now if the size of your window changes, your whole widget tree has to repaint or has to rebuild and all this stuff. And I would just point out if your available space changes, you definitely want your app to completely re-render.
Yes.
You need your app to relay out. You need all of the things to happen from scratch. So it is never a performance problem to say media query dot of size. Because imagine what would happen if a part of your app didn't repaint itself when the whole widget, someone just expands or shrinks the window. It's like, are you going to not use the new pixels that were just added because they expanded the window? So never worry about that.
That's only a problem when you have a 8-year-old daughter that loves to play with your screens.
That's funny. Okay, Randall has two questions now. Randall, I hope you're still here. You asked these a while ago, but they're great questions. Do you think of this as replacing the theme or enhancing it?
Yeah, so you can use with a theme. So for example, Mix has support for the material tokens and things like that to bring it in. However, it's not dependent on the theme itself.
Mm,
But for example, a spec is the same signature of a theme extension. So that kind of helps also to think about it, right? So a spec essentially is a theme extension that has a copy width, has a lerp for the same
mm,
reasons,
mhm,
right? Now the reason and again, you can use it instead of using parts of the theme, but I'm careful to say replace the theme because again, if you're using material and you have material widgets and you have a well laid out theme and so on, then you got to make the analysis if you're gonna make it more complicated if you really need it, and so on, right? Because Mix
mhm.
gives you flexibility, but as everyone knows, also, and we have one of our contributors, Lucas, which is working on the linter to help also some of those guidelines.
Oh,
Uh,
nice.
but is with a lot of flexibility means that you can do a lot of different things, right? You can have multiple utilities that are calling all the utilities, and the file organization is massive, so it won't protect you against a bad situation. So I think it's more about what is the use case, but I wouldn't say it can replace, but I want to suggest that was created to replace the theme. No.
Gotcha. Okay. And it sounds like they can absolutely coexist. If I want to
Yes.
start using Mix in part of my UI and the rest of it is using Material, then that's fine. A
Yeah.
follow-up question to that,
And
does Mix
this
depend on the Material library at all, or does it only depend on widgets?
So it depends on which I think eventually we can actually. I think at some point we had a material widget. I don't know for maybe the elevation. I think we removed
Mm,
it completely, but it's not dependent from, let's say, a widget perspective. So it does reference it because when there's values that sometimes it just comes from material,
mm,
uh, but it's not dependent material. Uh, to essentially run. But you have situations like this where maybe you want to use a material token here. And again,
mhm.
this is just a convention. But essentially, this is the equivalent of calling theme of of context text theme button. This is the equivalent of doing this here.
Interesting. Okay. Gotcha. All right. So this internally, So theming in Flutter is only present in the material library. It is not a concept in the widget library. And that kind of tells us right here, obviously we see $ material. So yes, Mix internally in various places imports material for some mechanics. I think that makes sense. Oh, but this could actually just be like code generation, $.
It's so here, and you're about to look at very bad code.
Nice. That's the kind of code that I know best.
But so pretty much is the same structure that you would create your own theme. We're just mapping the references, we call it like color resolvers, right? So you have color resolvers, text resolvers. So these are just tokens that resolve to a context, right? And this pretty much is the theme of, and so on. So a lot of this code will be replaced with code generated. But essentially it's just saying, hey, this token means it's going to call this resolver. And this resolver is going to call the theme of, and so on, right? So, and of course, it's the build context, and the text is right here, just an extension here, right? So you can see that .color is just calling this like this.
Gotcha.
Just to make it shorter. Just to make it less ugly and fail. It's still not, but you can see here that this is a prime example of code generation because they're just color resolvers. So in theory, again, material tokens, material reference, but it's calling material here because build context and text theme are coming from material, but that's it.
Wait, build context doesn't come from widgets?
Yeah, I just added from widget, but text theme, because of the token, it comes from material.
That one for sure. Yep. All right, next question. I'm also very interested in the answer to this one. How does Mix with Flutter Animate? And also, first of all, have you used Flutter Animate? Are you familiar with the package?
Yes. And
all right, why don't we summarize Flutter Animate real quick for anyone who has not? And would you like to do that, or would you like me to do that?
No, you can go ahead.
So Flutter Animate is a package from G-Skinner, which is a company that builds Flutter stuff for people all the time. They've made a lot of great things. And its concept is to have extension methods on widgets that, so you could say like container, blah, 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 you pass it all your different values. And then at the end of your definition of the container, this is in a build method, you can say .animate or actually, it's been a while since I've looked at the API, so I forget the names of all the different functions. But you can very, very, very easily apply certain animations to a widget and move its position around, or add a shimmer effect, or bring its opacity up or down, or kind of pulse it. They've got a lot of different very, very friendly utilities. And what it does internally in that extension method is basically just wrap whatever widget you were using with all the new dressing that is required to drive that animation. And so I think the reason this question is interesting is the Flutter Animate package is actually injecting another widget layer in your widget tree. And I can imagine that might kind of stand in between a widget that Flutter Animate was driving and then like mix stuff on top, or potentially Flutter Animate only knows how to work on base Flutter widgets and like doesn't know how to drive these mix concepts because they're each assuming that they get to work on the unmodified Flutter widget API. So have you played with this with Flutter Animate, and does it work?
Yeah, so one of the reasons that Mix was delayed, if you will, is because it became very specific where all the functionality would have to be built within Mix. And I saw packages like Flutter Animate said, we got to bring these type of packages that are doing different things, and you got to give them a path. And that's why the widget modifier, right, with the width, that essentially wraps the widget, is an API. And I'll just show one example of the widget, like when you do this is the equivalent here. If I do width dot opacity, okay. So essentially this, it calls the attributes, but you can see here that essentially is saying how to build the widget, right? It's telling you how to build the widget.
Mm-hmm.
So there's been like a lot of ideas, and we are thinking about doing one example. But one of the ways most likely is having a class primitive, which I think last time I checked the documentation they had, that allows to pass that down, because essentially that's what it's doing, right? It's just wrapping the widgets with a simple API, and create a modifier for that, right? So you can have something like, animate and generate the utility, right? Animates fade, do something. Animates light in, and you actually generate the utility itself. And I think it becomes a lot cleaner to implement. I think that's a great example for us to explore.
So one detail that I didn't quite pick up there is, are you imagining Mix offering a lot of the same functionality, or would this allow me to use Flutter Animate on widgets that I'm styling with Mix?
So I think it's a separate package that maybe creates these. Of course, you can add on your own package, but because of dependencies and so on. But essentially, have a separate package that if I want to pretty much bring it in, I want to say I want the Mix utilities for Flutter Animates, right?
I see.
It brings in those utilities in on a per package, and have these sub packages, multiple packages that can be used.
Got it.
I think that would probably be the best approach, because right now Mix doesn't have any dependency, and I think it's great because obviously for supports and compatibility and so on. So definitely want to bring these dependencies, but does this become a separate packages that kind of provides these type of supports?
I think I see. So let me try to repeat this back to you. So what you're saying is a hypothetical future package, and these would be bindings to various other packages out there, but we're talking about Flutter Animate now. Hypothetical future packages would use code generation, and they would they would add extensions in Mix that map one-to-one to each of the things that this other library, again, right now, Flutter Animate, does. So let's say Flutter Animate offers 12 utility methods. I have no idea what number they offer. A hypothetical Mix bindings library, so maybe it's Mix _ Flutter _ Animate, would know how to write, it would know how to generate or add, or whatever the mechanism is, 12 new methods to Mix. And maybe they show up in different places, and whatever all the details are, but those essentially know how to translate Mix concepts and then like pass them into the Flutter Animate method, and that is how you would use these things together. Was that correct?
Yes. So essentially it translates, once you pass these utilities that are going to return the attributes, is going to of course, because you have the dependency of Flutter Animate, it will go ahead and add the Flutter Animate to the widget tree.
Got it. Nice. Okay.
And one thing that is we also want to explore, because there are things to touch on, like directives. So for example, if you do text uppercase, so if I have a button that has a certain font, I can just do text uppercase, and it will modify the text when it gets resolved, right? So essentially it changes the text uppercase, title case, which is interesting because sometimes you just want to make sure that, hey, I just want to make sure it's title case. There's always a button, doesn't matter what gets passed through. So it allows these things that we call in directives, right? So there are options also for not just wrapping it, but also having almost like controllers that can modify specific pieces in within. So there's a lot of different options, and I think a lot of these things will be community or separate packages. We are working on a package that we're calling Remix.
Nice.
And pretty much is going to be headless remixable components. So that's where we go in and be more opinionated about, like, okay, if you want to do a design system, but maybe you don't want to do completely from scratch a foundation where all the business logic is already there, but you want to have full control of the styling, you can use something like Remix. So that's something that we're working on and we've used to validate a lot of these ideas also for Mix.
Well, I love that. That sounds very valuable. Okay, do I have any more questions? This one was specific. Again, this person asked this question 34 minutes ago. So, Yong, I hope you're still here. Can I change the animation curve? And I forget exactly what was on the screen when we saw this.
So you can. Short answer is there are a couple of ways, but if I just do animates, if I'm passing maybe typography here. Sorry. Just the styling. So pretty much I'm passing animate here.
Yep.
Yeah, I can just pass the curve within.
Oh, brilliant. Easy
and
peasy.
Yeah, and we also planning on adding like utility. So if you want to add animations within the style to override, maybe you want to reuse also the same curve throughout, and maybe just change the duration. Allows you to do that also.
I love it. Last question I had starred. This is a little softball for you. This person's just learning Flutter, and should they use Mix from the get-go? What do you think, Leo?
Of course not. Yeah, you should not. I think it's first of all, Flutter has everything, special material, especially if you're learning. You probably want to focus on how it works and not worry about the design system problem and the components, things like that, right? So at least abstract and focus on the inner workings. I think, at least for me, learning the layout system, because even if you learn Mix later, it's going to go one-to-one with the layout system. By having a good understanding of the layout system and also of the how widgets get built, when things get triggered, rebuilds or repaints and so on, I think that knowledge is a lot more important. And of course, state management, which I try to stay away from that. That's going to be a lot bigger.
We made it almost 100 minutes into the stream without saying state management.
I had to.
Yeah, that's a great answer. I was actually thinking about it in a much more simplistic way. You gave a very sage-like response. My thinking here, certainly after your wiser answer, is that what Leo said. If that reminds me of like someone who wants to use an ORM to talk to a database, and you should use an ORM, but you should understand the queries that it is generating for you first. Otherwise, the ORM will always just be confusing and mysterious and will surprise you. So I think there's some parallels here with Mix.
Yes.
I would personally love to see this kind of foundational UI composition, this way to declare styling, take off. I love the idea of remix. I think that is probably the other puzzle piece that would then collectively create a great foundation on top of which a lot of different I've talked with people on the team about how some of the decisions in Flutter have made it very hard for there to be an aftermarket of style libraries that people can opt into. And I think if there was a set of foundational builder widgets, that it sounds like that's what Remix may offer, and then Mix is of course there. If everyone's agreeing on these building blocks in Remix, then it stands to reason you could actually swap out different styles from a marketplace of Mix themes, and your app would actually just snap from one rich, interesting layout into another one, as long as you're using the Remix widgets underneath. And of course, maybe modifiers would complicate that.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure how that would all play out, but I love that idea. And my ideal future for Flutter is that an ecosystem like that emerges and is is a kind of default place where people look for the styling primitives and building blocks to build their apps. I would love to see that.
And I think that that's one thing that I mentioned is a little bit of a thesis is um, I do think there's a lot of more, some people like it, some people don't, but a lot of more at least try and error innovation happening. And sometimes I think it happens because of the abstraction for people to take chances and innovate. Because it's like I mentioned, some people can take it, mix and use it for, to style their own packages. Maybe it makes it easier to create components that can be styled. But I do think also there is a benefit of having a separation of styling. I do think it opens up for things like, for example, a prototype of not server rendered UI in a way, but like all the styling dependence, it can be easily server rendered through the styles, right? Because you already created abstraction that is there. And I saw one of the comments mentioned, which is something that that I played, but not a lot. I think that's going to be one of the talks I'm going to give that I'm calling generative UI. Because another thing that Mix allows you to do is because it's so separate from the widget tree, you can train it in a different way. You can get a lot better responses and use AI in creative ways, either for internal tools, building tools, even tools that maybe translate the Mix widget. One thing that we talked about is, people always want a way out. What if you have a tool that essentially turns your widget back to it turns your widget Mix widget back to your standard Flutter widget, in case like to give you an out or something like that. So I think there's a lot of different benefits that some people are exploring and playing with it, but I think it's exciting nonetheless.
Yeah, another place. I mean, gosh, when you talk about translating or like systems that flip you from one ecosystem to another, my brain immediately goes to converting a Figma mockup into actual widgets, or maybe not widgets, but like the styling, the combination of, well, it's always been a very hard challenge to say I can build a tool, which is why I think basically no one has done it. There is no tool that will reliably take actually I could be wrong. I'm not aware of a tool that will reliably take a Figma mockup, whatever is in that Figma mockup, and give you something coherent in Flutter. But if you could assume Mix and this hypothetical remix library, I think you could do that. And that would be awesome.
Yes.
And what it spits out, I don't know if you'd even bother spitting out the widgets, even if it just spit out the styles. So valuable, so cool. So that, again, you've got a lot on your plate. You're building the core system. Like, that sounds to me also like a community project. But given those shared fundamentals, I think it's actually realizable, maybe for the first time in Flutter's history. There was another comment I wanted to show. Oh, yeah. So Randall also said this should be coordinated with the Canvas project. I think he's talking about the blank Canvas project, in terms of providing core widgets that can be rethemed. And yeah, I'm definitely going to send this live stream episode towards Ian Hickson. And I talked to him for a bit at I/O about this kind of solution. I'm not kidding. I did both totally forget about Mix and then have just been thinking about it myself obsessively. So what an own goal. But I was talking to Ian for a bit at I/O a few months ago about my feeling that Flutter really needs this and what would it take. And of course, for anyone who doesn't know, Ian Hickson was one of the original TLs of all of Flutter, and he wrote the HTML5 spec. He's the primary author of how the internet works visually. And so he's the perfect person to compare these different ideas of merging a DOM tree with a style tree, and what does Flutter do now, and why did he make different decisions when he started the Flutter project versus what he had done in the web. And one thing he told me was that he had actually, in the earliest days of Flutter, they had something like CSS, but they got rid of it because of that very slow performance. But I think you're not hitting those same performance problems because, again, there isn't the merging of the two trees. Every single node in the widget tree for us, obviously it's the DOM and the web, there you don't have to programmatically scan the style tree and apply all the abstractions and apply the cascading and whatnot. There is still some cascading, that's that merge method, but it's just very explicit. And if you pass it into the widget where it's needed, then it doesn't have to go hunt and find it. And that saves so much time when you're trying to crank out a frame in just a couple milliseconds.
And
So
Dart has changed a lot since the beginnings of Flutter. So, for example, I think it's very exciting to see any overhead or any challenges that it might have, which again is just lists. But when you apply macro, what are some of the options that can opens up also for that? And Randall talked about the Canvas project. That's a project that I follow closely. Ideally, Remix uses the Canvas widgets, right, which are meant to be styling, and it just creates that mixed layer on top of the Canvas widget. Ideally, if that existed today, that's how it would work. So I do think they complement perfectly to each other, and I think it's the right direction for the community.
Yeah, one thing to be aware of in terms of the blank canvas project is the level of API that it intends to expose is at about the custom painter level. So that involves a bit more, it's definitely one step lower. It might even be two steps lower, but it's at least one step lower than what we're kind of all used to with the widget layer. You're doing canvas.drawRect, passing it values instead of colored box or something, right?
Yeah.
Because that's what colored box does under the hood, is eventually cache out in a render object that has a paint method that calls canvas.drawRect. And so I can imagine that being a bit of a shift for Mix if you had to work with custom painters and not widgets. But anyway, this is all stuff to be figured out in time.
Yeah, but it's exciting. I think it's the right direction, and we're seeing very big companies, enterprises with many users across the whole world coming into Flutter, and that becomes, I think, a more problem where they have very specific design guidelines. They want to have control, consistency, and so on. And funny enough, that's where we see the highest adoption of people see mixing, getting it, because I do think it's this not only design system, but sometimes a design system that has multiple brands within. So these are very challenging problems to handle just with material sometimes.
Yeah. All right, folks. Well, we filled our time here, and God, I loved every second of it.
Thank you,
Leo. I'll offer you the last word here before I talk about just upcoming content on the show and schedule and whatnot. Any last thoughts, Leo?
No, thank you for having me. It was fun to finally catch up. And yeah, I think I'm excited about the project. And of course, feedback, critiques, suggestions. I said, you can do it. Just make sure that you fix it also and commit. So I'm open to those things. Yeah. Thank you for having me.
Yeah. Well, I painstakingly remained ignorant of Mix between reaching out to you and this morning so that I could ask all of my beginner questions. But now I think I'm about to be a Mix user. So you might see me around in some issues or just talking about it on Twitter or whatnot. Man,
Thank you.
I'm excited. Thank you for building this. You must have put an uncountable amount of hours into getting Mix into the current state. You and all the contributors that you mentioned that have helped along the way. So big thanks from me.
A lot. Thank you.
Yeah. All right, folks. I will be off next week because I will be out of town. And then after that, Observable Flutter will resume like normal. So don't set your alarms next week, but then we'll be back on whatever the date is after that. All right, everyone. Thanks for tuning in. Thanks for all the great questions. I hope you enjoy using Mix in the future, like I will be doing,
Mhm.
and enjoy the week off. And I'll see everyone in 2 weeks.
Thank you.